Close your eyes and imagine a world where humanity never existed, where everything you know, everyone you love, and every moment of human history was erased from existence. This wasn't just a possibility, it was nearly a reality. 900,000 years ago, our entire species came within a whisper of total extinction, and if a single chain of events had unfolded differently, you wouldn't be here to hear this story. This is not speculation or fantasy. This is science. This is history. And this is the most shocking discovery about human origins that researchers have unveiled in decades. For thousands of years, anthropologists have studied the bones and artifacts left behind by our ancient ancestors. They've pieced together the puzzle of human evolution, trying to understand where we came from and how we survived in a world filled with danger and uncertainty. But there was always something that didn't quite add up. There was a gap in the fossil record, an unexplained silence in the archaeological evidence that lasted over 100,000 years. It was as if humanity simply vanished from the face of the earth during this period, leaving behind almost no trace of their existence. Scientists scratched their heads, puzzled by this mysterious void in our evolutionary story. They had bones from before this period and bones from after this period, but virtually nothing in between. For decades, this mystery remained unsolved, a puzzle piece that simply didn't fit into the picture of human evolution that we thought we understood. Then came a breakthrough that would change everything. In August of 2023, a team of international scientists published a study in the prestigious journal Science that revealed the shocking truth hidden within our DNA. By analyzing the genetic code of more than 3,000 modern humans from populations across Africa, Europe, Asia, and beyond, these researchers discovered evidence of a catastrophic bottleneck in human population history. A bottleneck is what geneticists call it when a population crashes so dramatically that it nearly ceases to exist. It's a point of no return, where survival itself becomes a matter of pure chance and luck. And this particular bottleneck was unlike anything scientists had ever documented before. The research was led by Wang Jiehu, a population geneticist at the Econ School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City, working in collaboration with an international team including Haiping Li from the Chinese Academy of Sciences and Yi Xuan Pan from East China Normal University. These scientists didn't rely on ancient bones or fossils to piece together this story. Instead, they used a revolutionary new method that allowed them to read the history of humanity, written in the IC genetic code of people living today. They developed a sophisticated computational tool called the Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent Process, or FIT-COAL for short. This tool was specifically designed to circumvent the accumulation of numerical errors that typically occurs when scientists try to unravel these ancient demographic events. The methodology was elegant and groundbreaking. By examining the patterns of genetic variation in modern human populations, the researchers could work backwards through time, tracing how populations had split, merged, and changed over hundreds of thousands of years. Think of it like reading the rings of a tree, but instead of rings, you're reading the DNA sequences that carry within them the fingerprints of ancient population changes. The team analyzed genomic data from 3,154 individuals, representing 10 African populations and 40 non-African populations from around the world. They looked at how gene lineages had diverged over time, creating a detailed map of human population history stretching back nearly 1 million years into the past. What they discovered was absolutely staggering. Between approximately 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the entire breeding population of human ancestors collapsed to just 1,280 individuals. Let that number sink in for a moment. 1,280. In today's terms, that's smaller than the population of a small town. That's fewer people than live in many apartment buildings in major cities around the world. That was the entire human race. This represented a loss of roughly 98.7% of our ancestral population. Before this catastrophic crash, the estimated population had numbered somewhere between 58,600 and 135,000 individuals, still small by modern standards, but vastly larger than what would come next. Then, something changed. Something in the environment, in the climate, in the world itself transformed in a way that was absolutely catastrophic for human survival. The research team didn't just identify when this bottleneck occurred. They also determined how long it lasted. For approximately 117,000 years, the entire human population remained at this incredibly small size. Imagine living through 117,000 years of constant danger, where your species teetered on the edge of extinction for every single one of those years. It wasn't a brief crisis that our ancestors weathered quickly and then recovered from. It was a prolonged nightmare of survival against overwhelming odds. Every year, every generation, every individual that managed to reproduce was essential to keeping humanity alive. A single disease, a particularly harsh winter, a catastrophic drought lasting just a few extra years could have wiped out the entire species permanently. Scientists believe they have identified what triggered this catastrophic population collapse. During this period, the Earth's climate underwent dramatic changes. The archaeological and geological evidence points to a time of extreme cold and prolonged drought that swept across Africa and Eurasia. The climate became harsher, more unpredictable, and less hospitable to human life. Food sources that our ancestors had relied upon for survival became scarce or disappeared entirely. Water, the most essential resource for all life, became difficult to find as droughts persisted across continents. The Earth was essentially undergoing climate upheaval, and human populations, already fragile and vulnerable, were pushed to the very brink of extinction by these environmental pressures. The fossil record actually supports this environmental explanation. Geological studies from this era show evidence of cooling temperatures and decreased rainfall across multiple continents. Lake levels dropped dramatically, vegetation patterns shifted, the savanna became more sparse and inhospitable. Megafauna, the large animals that humans hunted for food, also suffered population crashes during this period. The entire ecosystem that had sustained human populations was collapsing, and humans, as just one species among many, felt the full force of these climatic changes. It was a perfect storm of environmental catastrophe, and our ancestors were caught directly in its path with almost no way to escape. What makes this discovery even more profound is what it reveals about human resilience and the sheer improbability of our existence. Think about it. If the climate had remained harsh just a little bit longer, if that single chain of reproduction events had failed at any point during those 117,000 years, humanity would have gone extinct. We would have ceased to exist. Just another species that failed to adapt. Just another entry in the vast catalog of extinct creatures that once walked the earth and are now forgotten by time. The world would have continued on just fine without us. Other species would have evolved, competed, survived. But the specific humans, the Homo sapiens, the people with our DNA, our consciousness, our capacity for art and language and love would never have existed. The recovery from this bottleneck appears to have been facilitated by environmental improvements and one crucial behavioral innovation. Around 813,000 years ago, as the climate shifted to become more hospitable for human life, as temperatures rose and rainfall increased, the surviving human populations began to expand again. Their numbers grew slowly at first, then more rapidly as conditions improved. Archaeological evidence suggests that the control of fire played a crucial role in this recovery. The earliest evidence of humans systematically using fire to cook food dates back to approximately 780,000 years ago in what is now modern-day Israel. Fire was transformative technology. It allowed humans to expand their diet beyond raw plants and meat. It provided warmth in cold climates. It offered protection from predators. It enabled social bonding around the hearth and fire. The mastery of fire was a turning point in human evolution, and it may have come precisely when our ancestors needed it most. As the population recovered and expanded, new species evolved from the surviving lineage. The fossil and genetic evidence suggests that these survivors of the bottleneck became the common ancestors of multiple hominin species that emerged in the following hundreds of thousands of years. They became ancestral to Homo heidelbergensis, a species that lived around 500,000 years ago, and is represented in the fossil record by skulls and other remains found across Africa, Europe, and Western Asia. They eventually became ancestral to the Neanderthals, those robust humans that would dominate Europe during the last ice age until they went extinct approximately 40,000 years ago. They became ancestral to the Denisovans, a mysterious human species that we know primarily through DNA recovered from ancient fossils and through genetic traces that still persist in modern populations, particularly in Asia and Oceania. And ultimately, they became ancestral to us, Homo sapiens, modern humans, the species that would eventually dominate the planet and create all of human civilization. This discovery helps explain one of the most puzzling gaps in the fossil record that has perplexed anthropologists for nearly half a century. The scarcity of hominin fossils and artifacts dating to the period between roughly 950,000 and 650,000 years ago has been a consistent puzzle. Archaeologists have found abundant evidence of human activity before this period and abundant evidence after this period, but the middle section is mysteriously sparse. The reasons for this archaeological gap have been debated by scholars for decades. Some thought it was simply a matter of luck and preservation. Perhaps the geological conditions during those 300,000 years just didn't favor the preservation of fossils or artifacts. Perhaps bones decayed more readily or were not buried in ways that allowed them to fossilize. But now, this genetic study suggests an alternative explanation. Perhaps the gap exists because there were so few humans alive during this time that fewer artifacts were created, fewer camps were established, and fewer remains were left behind. A tiny population leaves a tiny archaeological footprint. The implications of this research extend far beyond mere historical curiosity. This study reveals something profound about the nature of human existence and our relationship with our environment. It demonstrates that humans are not invulnerable or immune to extinction. We are not automatically guaranteed to survive. There were moments in our past when we were just as vulnerable as any other species, just as subject to the whims of climate and environmental change. Our ancestors survived not because of any special protection or advantage, but through a combination of luck, resilience, adaptability, and the sheer stubbornness of a species determined to reproduce and continue existing against overwhelming odds. They survived through cooperation, through the sharing of knowledge and resources, through the bonds of family and community that held them together through catastrophe. This discovery also provides a sobering perspective on our current age. Today we face climate change and environmental challenges unlike anything humanity has ever experienced, but not entirely unprecedented in the context of our ancient past. We know that our ancestors survived dramatic climate shifts. We know they adapted to changing conditions and bounced back from near extinction, but we also know how close they came to total annihilation. Just 1,280 individuals. That's the entire human species, hanging by a thread. It took 117,000 years for recovery. In our modern era, with global populations, interconnected economies, and unprecedented technological capabilities, our situation is vastly different from that of our ancient ancestors. We have tools they never had. We have knowledge they never possessed. But we also have vulnerabilities they never faced. We depend on complex systems of agriculture, trade, and technology that could be disrupted in ways our ancestors never had to consider. The research methodology used in this study represents a revolutionary approach to studying ancient human history. For decades, paleontologists and archaeologists relied primarily on physical evidence: bones, teeth, stone tools, cave paintings. These artifacts tell us stories, but they also have significant limitations. Ancient remains don't always preserve well. They're geographically biased, concentrated in certain regions, where conditions favor fossilization. They don't tell us everything we need to know about population dynamics, intergenetics, the new frontier of anthropology. By analyzing the DNA of modern humans, scientists can now look back through time in ways that were impossible just a generation ago. They can see population bottlenecks and expansions. They can trace migration patterns and admixture events when populations mixed. They can identify the approximate dates of major evolutionary events. The genome is a historical record written in the language of DNA. And as our ability to read and interpret that record improves, we gain new insights into our past. The Fit-Cole method developed by the research team is particularly sophisticated because it can handle the massive computational challenges involved in analyzing thousands of whole genomes simultaneously. Traditional methods would accumulate errors as they tried to model increasingly complex demographic scenarios over hundreds of thousands of years. Fit-Cole was designed specifically to avoid this problem, providing more accurate estimates of ancient population sizes and the timing of demographic events. The team tested their findings multiple times, running cross-checks to ensure that their results were robust and reliable. When they initially discovered hints of the bottleneck about 5 years before publication, they were cautious. Scientists don't jump to dramatic conclusions based on initial results. They test and retest. They look for alternative explanations. They try to find ways their hypothesis could be wrong. Only after multiple confirmations using Fit-Cole did the team become confident enough to publish their findings. The international collaboration behind this research demonstrates how modern science works at its best. Researchers from China, the United States, Italy, and other nations work together, combining expertise from genetics, anthropology, archaeology, and geology. Wang Jiehu and Ziqian Hao from the Shanghai Institute of Nutrition and Health and East China Normal University were the lead authors. Fabio Di Vincenzo from the University of Florence brought expertise in fossil analysis and morphology. Giorgio Manzi from Sapienza, University of Rome, contributed knowledge of African fossils and evolutionary history. Yun Xinfu from the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston provided additional statistical expertise. This team understood that understanding the deep past of humanity requires multiple perspectives and disciplines working in concert. The publication of this research in Science, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, was significant. Science has rigorous peer review standards. The study was reviewed by leading experts in population genetics, anthropology, and evolutionary biology. These reviewers scrutinized every method, every assumption, every conclusion. Only after satisfying these expert reviewers did the paper reach publication. This process lends credibility to the findings, though it's important to note that science is always provisional. New evidence can emerge, new analyses can be conducted. Other researchers can challenge or refine the conclusions. And indeed, that's exactly what has happened in the years following the original publication. Some researchers have raised questions about whether the bottleneck findings are accurate or whether they might represent statistical artifacts, errors or anomalies that arise from the computational methods used to analyze the data. In January 2025, scientists from Oxford University published a paper questioning whether the severe bottleneck inferred by the Fit-Cole method might be the result of statistical issues rather than actual historical events. They suggested that the site frequency spectrum, the distribution of genetic variants used to infer population history, might not be sufficient to definitively prove such a severe bottleneck. In response, the original research team has re-examined their analyses and reaffirmed that both the timing and severity of the bottleneck appear to be virtually identical when examining African and non-African populations separately, which strengthens the case that the bottleneck was real and not merely an artifact of the statistical method. This ongoing scientific debate is actually healthy and important. Science progresses through challenge and refinement. When researchers propose bold new findings, other scientists should examine them critically. This is how we separate reliable findings from errors or misinterpretations. The fact that the original research team can confidently defend their findings against criticism suggests that the bottleneck is likely real. But scientists also remain appropriately cautious and continue to gather more data and develop more sophisticated analytical methods to refine our understanding. This is how knowledge advances. The environmental context of the bottleneck has been thoroughly examined by paleoclimatologists and geologists. They've analyzed ice cores from Antarctica that contain tiny air bubbles trapped in ancient ice, providing direct measurements of atmospheric composition and temperature going back hundreds of thousands of years. They've studied ocean sediment cores that reveal the history of ocean temperature and circulation patterns. They've examined pollen records and geological strata that show changes in vegetation and climate. All of this evidence converges on a single conclusion. Between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the climate was indeed harsh and unstable. There were periods of extreme cold. Droughts persisted across Africa and Eurasia. The conditions were not favorable to large human populations. The entire planet was in the grip of a climatic crisis. And humans, as vulnerable organisms without the benefit of technology or agriculture, were pushed to the absolute edge of survival. The significance of this discovery extends into multiple fields of human knowledge. For evolutionary biologists, it demonstrates that extreme population bottlenecks can be survived, and that species can recover from near extinction and go on to diversify into multiple forms. For climatologists and environmental scientists, it provides historical perspective on how humans have responded to climate change in the deep past. For archaeologists, it offers an explanation for a long-standing mystery in the fossil record. For philosophers and theologians, it raises profound questions about chance, necessity, and the contingency of human existence. Had history unfolded slightly differently, none of us would be here. Our existence is built on the survival of an impossibly small population of ancestors against overwhelming odds. When you think about the approximately 8 billion humans alive on Earth today, it's almost impossible to comprehend that we all descend from just 1,280 individuals who survived that ancient catastrophe. Every person you've ever met, every human being who has ever lived in recorded history, every great civilization, every scientific discovery, every work of art, every moment of human love and connection, all of it descends from that tiny population. From those 1,280 survivors, humanity expanded and diversified. We spread across every continent. We developed different skin colors and body shapes adapted to different environments. We created thousands of languages and cultures. We built cities and civilizations. We learned to read and write and think about our own existence. We went from the edge of extinction to becoming the dominant species on the planet. This recovery was not inevitable. There is no law of nature that says species must recover from bottlenecks. In fact, most species that experience severe bottlenecks do not recover. They go extinct. They disappear from the fossil record. Their lineages end, and they are succeeded by other species better adapted to the changing world. But our ancestors survived. They managed to reproduce, just barely, year after year, generation after generation for more than a century of thousands of years. Each individual that survived and reproduced was essential. The loss of any one breeding individual during this period could have changed the trajectory of human history. It's a powerful reminder of how fragile life is and how dependent we all are on countless tiny events and circumstances that happened in the distant past. The future implications of understanding this bottleneck are also profound. As we face our own environmental challenges in the modern era, including climate change, habitat loss, and biodiversity decline, the example of our ancestors carries important lessons. It shows that species can be incredibly resilient when faced with environmental stress, but it also shows that they can be brought to the very brink of extinction. For humans specifically, it demonstrates that we have faced existential threats before and overcome them. But it also suggests that we should not take our survival for granted, or assume that our technology will automatically shield us from all possible catastrophes. The fact that this genetic bottleneck can be detected so clearly in modern human genomes shows the power of genetic research. Our DNA carries within it the history of humanity. As our technology for sequencing and analyzing DNA improves, we continue to discover new details about our past. We've learned that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, leaving genetic traces in our genomes today. We've discovered migrations and population, movements that weren't documented in any historical record. We've traced the spread of agriculture, the development of cities, and the movement of peoples across continents, all through the lens of genetic analysis. The bottleneck discovered in 2023 is part of a larger picture of human history that genetics is revealing to us. The diversity of human populations today emerged from this incredibly small founding population. When a large population is reduced to a small number of individuals, there is necessarily a loss of genetic diversity. The surviving individuals can only pass on a fraction of genetic variants that existed in the larger original population. This means modern humans have less genetic diversity than our ancient ancestors did before the bottleneck. We're all more closely related genetically than humans were in that pre-bottleneck era. Some genetic variations were simply lost forever when individuals carrying them died without reproducing. This has important implications for understanding human genetics today and the patterns we see in modern human genomes. Another aspect of this research involves different human species that coexisted during the bottleneck recovery period. While our direct ancestors experienced severe population crash between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, not all hominin species were equally affected. Some fossil evidence suggests species like Homo antecessor continued in Europe and Asia. This raises questions about how different species responded to the environmental crisis. Did they occupy different ecological niches that made them less vulnerable? Did they have different behavioral adaptations that allowed better survival? These questions remain open and represent important areas for future research, helping us understand evolutionary principles of how species respond to environmental stress. Geological and paleontological evidence supporting the bottleneck hypothesis comes from multiple sources. Ancient pollen in lake sediments shows that between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, vegetation shifted toward drier habitats across Africa and Eurasia. Forests retreated and grasslands expanded. This vegetation shift affected animals that humans hunted. Fossil bones from large animals show signs of stress and starvation. The megafauna that human hunters relied on suffered through harsh climate. When prey struggles to survive, hunting becomes extremely difficult. Food insecurity reaches critical levels. Under these conditions, human population decline is inevitable. The study of this bottleneck also illuminates the question of how human populations are connected and how they've been connected over deep time. The genetic data analyzed in this research showed that the bottleneck affected both African and non-African populations in similar ways. This tells us that despite some migrations and population movements, there was still sufficient gene flow between different regions to maintain a connected human species. It wasn't that Africa had one population that crashed while other parts of the world were unaffected. Rather, it appears that the environmental crisis was global in scale, affecting human populations across multiple continents. The climate disruption wasn't localized to one region. It was part of a planet-wide pattern of climatic instability that affected habitats everywhere our ancestors lived. Scientists continue to refine their understanding through multiple approaches. Paleoanthropologists search for fossils showing evidence in bone and tooth morphology. Archaeologists excavate sites looking for patterns reflecting a reduced population. Climate scientists refine ancient climate models. Geneticists develop new computational methods for analyzing genetic data. Interdisciplinary collaborations bring together researchers from many fields to provide comprehensive understanding of this critical period in human history. The resilience demonstrated by our ancestors during the bottleneck period offers important lessons for the modern world. Our ancestors faced a genuine existential threat. Their world was changing in ways they couldn't predict or control. Resources that had always been available became scarce. The climate was unstable and inhospitable, yet they persisted. They continued to reproduce and raise children. They maintained social bonds and cooperation. They shared knowledge and resources. They survived through cultural practices, tool-making innovations, and adaptability. They proved that humans have remarkable capacity to endure hardship and continue the species even under the most extreme conditions. This history should inspire us with confidence in human resilience, but it should also remind us that our survival is not guaranteed, and that we must take seriously the threats to human well-being and the biosphere that we face today. The discovery also reminds us of the interconnectedness of all life on Earth. Humans didn't evolve in isolation. Our ancestors lived in ecosystems with plants and animals. They depended on those ecosystems for survival. When the climate changed and the ecosystems shifted, human populations were affected. The megafauna faced their own population crashes. Plant communities were reorganized. The entire structure of the living world was rearranged during the bottleneck period. This shows us that human history is always embedded within natural history. We cannot separate the story of humanity from the story of the Earth and its climate systems. What happens to the environment happens to us. Environmental change drives human history, though human choices also shape environmental conditions. This bidirectional relationship between humans and nature will be increasingly important to understand as we navigate our own environmental challenges in the 21st century. In conclusion, the discovery of the ancient bottleneck 900,000 years ago represents one of the most significant findings in human evolutionary science in recent decades. It explains long-standing mysteries in the fossil record. It demonstrates how our species came perilously close to extinction. It reveals the power of genetics to uncover hidden chapters of our past. It shows that humans are not immune to environmental catastrophe and that our survival, even today, depends on our adaptability, our cooperation, and our ability to respond to challenges. The 1,280 individuals who survived that ancient crisis carried within them the potential for all of human civilization to come. They survived against overwhelming odds, and in doing so, they gave us the chance to exist. That is why this discovery matters. That is why we should pay attention to what it tells us about our past and what it might teach us about our future. We are the descendants of the survivors of an ancient apocalypse, and that heritage carries with it both humility and hope. As you go about your life, remember that you exist because a tiny group of humans survived an impossible crisis millions of years ago. You are the product of countless generations of survivors, each one overcoming the challenges of their time. That remarkable inheritance is your connection to the deep past of humanity.